Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the changes in the lifestyles of people during the 18th century, right? So we left off in class talking about the next change in our entire thing. So we started talking about our population change, and y'all were just shouting out Mr. Gillian left and right, being like, oh, slash and burn, oh, distance decay, blah, blah, blah. Now, but the big thing about it, though, is we talked a lot about population growth, right? We talked a lot about population growth and how basically we need the death rate to go down and the birth rate to go up, right? And also we just started discussing like reasons why that happened, right? We started talking about how the Black Plague is going to finally come to an end. We started talking about new diets and then the integration of Columbian exchange items into the diets of Europeans, giving them longer life expectancies. Talking about better medicines. The eradication of smallpox pretty much comes down by about the year 1800. So we're going to see the growth of the European medical field. You're going to see the growth of the life expectancy as well. And you're going to see a massive population increase at right around that time that little ice age finally started to end. Speaking of the little ice age, though, we then started talking about the biggest effect that the little ice age had, right? And that was the fact that it had a massive effect on food production. So the biggest, one of the biggest changes you're going to see is a very, very large change in the output of food, okay? So, you're going to see the agricultural sector of Europe begin to produce food at a rate that it never had before. You're going to see literally percent increases in the hundreds, right? Apparently, England went from producing, one, level of food to then 300% more within, 150 years, okay? So a lot of that, though, has to do with the adoption of new techniques and the getting rid of really, really old garbage ones. So they got rid of this thing called the open field system, right? And the open field system was this really, really bad, system where they basically used what's known as common or communal land, right? So basically the way that this would work is a village would share all of the land and then farm everything in strips, and the strips would then go to them, and then also parts of it may go to the landlord who owns it or may not. It depends on who owns it. If it's commonly owned land, it's actually owned by the village in total, right? So a little bit of it depends on who you are, a little bit depends on where you are, and a little bit depends on who owns that land. But the biggest thing about it is that no matter what, when you're looking at this system, it was really, really inefficient because at least 33.333 Alexandra percent of your actual farmland was just sitting there doing this thing known as fallowing, right? Because literally, just like Chloe said in class, all the wheat and barley tended to go whoop and suck all the nutrients out of the soil. So they had to literally leave a third of their land there to just sit and do nothing for a year so it could replenish a lot of its nutrients. You're also going to see other problems with this as well, including the fact that disease could spread very, very easily amongst the animals and that the crop yield was minimal. And if there was any type of weather pattern change, it dramatically affected the production of the open field system. But you're going to see this thing start around 1650 and last till about 1850, which is going to be known as the agricultural revolution. The agricultural revolution is going to be a huge effort pushed forward by the Dutch and the English, right? But the Dutch did it first, right? Because let's never forget, the Dutch don't lose land to the ocean. They take it back, right? Looking at literally this entire map of the Netherlands right there, everything in brown, yellow, and maybe this darker brown right here is land that was reclaimed by the Dutch periodically. They have built cities on top of this reclaimed land. They have began to farm on top of this reclaimed land. They literally create, look at that, little windmills over there, right? So the coolest thing about this entire thing, though, is that not only was Dutch drainage a really, really big thing, and also the English are going to follow suit and do the exact same thing in some of the swampland territories and some of the other areas up towards where modern day Manchester and out towards northern London is. They're also going to introduce a new system as well, known as crop rotation. Now, this is one of my favorite things to talk about. Do not ask me why. I find this so interesting. But Grace, if you're going to actually have this farm or garden or whatever you're talking about, you're going to need to know what this is. So give me 2 seconds. We're going to jump over to my board over on the other side. Let's talk about crop rotation. And this guy who actually brought it to England, known as Robert Turnip Townshend. All right. We're over here at the board real quick so we can actually draw something really fast. You can see it a little bit. There's old Mary Queen of Scots right there. But the thing that we now need to talk about is this guy that is English who actually introduced the crop rotation system that was perfected by the Dutch by a man by the name of Robert Turnip Townshend, right? Now, really, really quickly, Turnip, not his actual name, it's a nickname, right? And a lot of it has to do with the fact that he actually introduced the turnip crop to the crop rotation system that's going to be used in England. It's going to help replenish the soil annually, right? So Robert Turnip Townshend brought with him from the Netherlands an idea that he actually saw the Dutch do, right? And he wanted to perfect it a little bit to make it a little bit more like English, right? And so basically what's going to happen is the fields would be subdivided into about 4 quadrants, right? So you got a field right here, and then it'd be bang, bang, and it would be divided into 4 parts. Now, there are 2 key crops that they need to plant every single year so they can make enough bread, right? And that be your wheat and that be your barley, right? So now these 2 crops are going to be extremely important because these are your bread staples, right? Now, you got a couple other ones, though, as well that he's going to introduce, including turnips and clover, right? So the thing about the turnips and the clover and the reason why you would introduce these crops into a crop rotation system is because turnips are a root tuber vegetable, right? They literally like sit underneath the ground. I don't know if you've ever seen a turnip before. My dad eats them like they're an apple. It's like a whole thing. So like he'll literally like pull one out of the dirt and then he pulls like a salt packet from McDonald's out of his pocket and then he just pours it on there and he eats it, right? Now the thing about it is that's gross. I don't like turnips very much at all, but they're like kind of in the radish family and stuff like that, but they sit underneath the ground. So no matter what you do when you ever plant turnips, you're only going to get so many of them. But what you're going to have though is a huge amount of die-off, right? You're going to have a lot of like turnip greens that die off and go back into the soil and replenish it. And you're going to have a huge number of turnips that actually never get pulled out, but they sit underneath and they rot and fertilize the soil a little bit. And then you have this stuff. Clover. Clover, you know, I've all seen 1,000 times before. Clover is that stuff that you went through when you were little, the weeds that you went through when you were little, and you tried to find a 4-leaf one, right? Now, clover is really, really important because it is full of nitrogen, right? It's full of nitrogen, and nitrogen has to be in the soil to grow really, really solid crops, okay? So nitrogen actually is put into the soil by the clover, and as the clover dies off as well, as this weed just kind of grows and then dies off. Now, the other interesting thing about the clover, though, is that you can also graze your animals around the clover, right? Clover, it being rich in nitrogen, is actually very, very good fodder for animals to graze on top of. So not only is this system creating more wheat and barley, but it's also creating more land for animal husbandry and for actually creating more animal, which gives us more access to meat, which is also going to be better for our diets in general, okay? So the thing about it, though, when we're looking at this, the animals also not only... Big shout out to everybody that's going to be like kind of common sense right here. I can just hear Penelope in the background freaking out. Oh, not only are the animals eating the clover, but they're pooping. Yeah, exactly. And the animals are literally going to the bathroom all over the clover field, fertilizing the soil as well. And what you would do is the next following year, you just rotate them. You put your wheat right here, put your clover right there, put your turnip right there, put your barley right there, and it literally creates a system where the crops are constantly replenishing themselves, right? Gotta love crop rotation. You should never plant the same thing in the same plot of land twice, or like 1 year after the other. Grace, all right? Little shout out for that. Now anyway, let's jump back over here real fast and let's keep talking about a couple of other things. But yeah, so that's the crop rotation system that was actually introduced during the agricultural revolution that's going to be super, super important as well. Now, the next thing we have to also talk about is also the enclosure of land. Now, this one's a really, really interesting one because it's actually going to make people in Europe, especially rich people in Europe, a lot richer. It's going to make people like much more wealthy, and the landowners of this land are going to actually grow in efficiency. They're going to make a lot more stuff. They're going to grow a lot more goods, but it's also going to kind of lead to the urbanization of cities a little bit. But what enclosure of land is in general is the destruction of common lands, right? They're going to move away from this where villages share all the land to where they move towards a system where they would enclose it and fence it all in, right? And basically privatize all the land and create mass large farms. And every single one of these enclosures, or a handful of them, would actually be farmed by an individual family, not necessarily in a village, but actually they would actually be working for the lord or the landowner themselves, right? The enclosure of land is going to be really, really big, and it actually makes Robert Turnip Townshend's crop rotation system super, super efficient. The other big thing about it, though, as well, is that the enclosure of land could not be made possible without new technologies that are going to pop up that are going to make it easier to farm those larger enclosures of land for one family each, right? Because you got to understand that the villages in the common land of the open field system in the Middle Ages was necessary, y'all. They needed to do that, right? In the Middle Ages, that was their only real option because they didn't have the technology or the technological resources to be able to farm large areas or swaths of land like these enclosures would later need. The technology that's going to pop up during the agricultural revolution will make the enclosure of land possible and will make the commercialization of agriculture possible as well. Two big pieces of tech that are going to come out that serve as really good examples. One of them is this one. It's known as the seed drill, right? That thing is called a seed drill, invented by a man by the name of Jethro Tull. Not the band Jethro Tull from the 80s, okay, in case I got any parents listening in the background right now. Not Jethro Tull the band, but Jethro Tull, the English inventor, invented this thing called the seed drill, which is actually what you could refer to as basically a proto-tractor, right? So, because the way it actually works, it's a seed planter, right? The way that the entire system works is you see these two small little cutter plows on the bottom. They actually would cut into the dirt, making small little troughs on top of rows, right? And then the vibrations of it actually going down the entire, like going down the field, would actually shake these hoppers and the seeds would spill out the back. And then there are two little rakes here in the back that then cover the dirt back over them again. This system was this device was extremely more efficient than the old system of what was known as casting, right? Casting is basically when the common lands, you would all just go out into the field together and you'd have bags of seed and you just cast it, right? Like you just go like this. Issue with that is rain could kill some of the seeds, some of them don't germinate, and then also on top of everything else, birds might come and eat a buttload of them, right? Whereas with the seed drill, it's literally cutting, planting, or like cutting, seeding, and covering all of everything, making it so that your crop yields will be a heck of a lot higher. Now, the next one, though, is also known as the Rotherham plow. Rotherham, by the way, is spelled R-O-T-H-E-R-A-M. The Rotherham plow is basically an ox-driven plow that has a metal or iron tip on it. So it can actually easily cut through the dirt, and it can actually turn the job of many people plowing land into just one and an ox, right? So like these pieces of technology are going to make the systematic farming much more systematic, okay? And then going forward as well, you've got new crops coming in, right? You got the turnip popping up in England, which is going to be really, really big. And then you also have many new crops coming from like the Americas because the Columbian Exchange is finally beginning to take hold, which is also going to make people's diets better, which is going to lead to higher life expectancy. So the agricultural revolution and population growth are actually intertwined, right? So going into the next one though, what are the effects of this revolution though? Particularly focusing on enclosure, right? Because the number one thing we're going to see change is the ownership of land, who lives there, where does everyone live, and how do they find work, right? So going into it, we have two groups of people that this is going to massively affect, right? We have effects on the rich and we have effects on the poor, right? Now, the first one that we got to talk about is the commercialization of agriculture, right? So the feudal system was great for providing food for a lord, providing them with a small income, and then also like actually using the land of which they own and having it being labored upon by serfs, right? That worked really well for them. The common lands worked like decently enough. Small landholders did decently enough. But what's going to actually occur following the enclosure system is the mass commercialization of agriculture. You're going to see the growth of the idea where large like farms owned by wealthy families are going to produce tons of crops, and you're going to see that actually grow their wealth as well. And you're going to see the systematic growth of these things grow extremely quickly throughout the years, right? And small landholders, though, as well, they're going to begin to lose their farms, right? All of that common land is going to basically be gone because the Enclosure Acts in England actually came down where they all but eradicated it. And they literally were like, oh, all common land can now be easily bought by lords and seized by other like higher up families. And they just started buying up everything and enclosing it without even asking anybody. And let's say hypothetically, though, you didn't live on the common land. Let's say hypothetically you were a small landholder. Well, most of them had to actually sell their land to rich people because they could not compete. They simply could not put out the same volume of like actual goods that these larger commercial farms are now actually putting out. More money, though, also is going to be coming from higher output, so the rich are going to become richer because of the commercialization of agriculture and then also because of the enclosure movement. But also the other big thing about it is, on the rich, there's going to be a more systematic approach. The crop rotation will create a more stable production system, and the use of technology will create a more stable production system, helping us to avoid famine. And then also the other big thing about it is also helping us actually to make sure that there are surpluses of food, right? Now, the price of that food is going to change all the time, but we'll get to that when we get to the French Revolution and talk about how 1 week a 4-pound loaf of bread could cost like $5 and then the next week it could cost $15, right? So like now, big thing about it though also on the poor though in particular, you got two groups of people of the poor, okay? You've got one, the people that will stay in the rural areas, which the bulk of them did, right? The bulk of them actually worked on these farms and worked on these enclosure system farms. The thing about it though is those people, we have to talk about them, and then we have to talk about the people that were forced off, right? So the people that actually stayed in the rural areas are also going to realize something very, very important. Now, I need y'all to focus on this. This is super important, okay? What's going to happen is that the enclosure system, its use of new technology and its use of new crop rotational systems is not going to require as much labor all day long as it used to, right? There's going to be new technologies that come along that make the growing of crops and the actual harvesting of crops more efficient. Later on, the thresher comes out, and it actually is something that can harvest wheat for you without using a hand sickle. And so as the devices begin to grow and as the agricultural revolution continues to roll forward, it means that you work less and less hours a day if you still live out in the countryside. So what are you going to do with your free time? Some of y'all are like, oh no, sit around and watch Netflix. No, you're not going to do that at all. The family actually just found more work, right? They found more work, and instead of working outside, they worked inside, right? And they developed this thing known as the cottage industry, right? The cottage industry began to be a system where peasants that lived in rural areas began to actually make things in their house for sale or to sell to a merchant who would then go off and act as a middleman and sell it for them, right? So these people are now also not only going to be working less on the farms when it comes to their daily hours, but they're also going to be working a little bit and making some side cash, right? This is oftentimes known as the industrious revolution, not the industrial revolution. But the thing about the cottage industry, though, is you can make a little bit of extra money, right? You can make a little bit of extra money. It's putting some money in your pocket, right? You might be able to go out and buy some stuff, right? But now a lot of merchants, though, in the cities start realizing, wait a minute, if the Wilson family has a cottage, and the Arnold family has a cottage, and the Lee family has a cottage, and the Leday family has a cottage, and they're all making stuff in their cottages, this isn't as efficient as it could be, right? So the cottage industry, whenever you've got all those different families trying their best to make fabrics, by the way, most of them were making textiles, right? Due to the fact that a lot of the animals that actually grazed on that crop rotation system of those fields of clover were sheep in England because they actually live very, very easily there, and they produce wool, and then excessive amounts of wool are going to actually lead to you making stuff out of that wool so you can make a little extra money. Now, the thing about it, though, when we're looking at this, you got to understand that instead of having all those families try desperately to card wool and spin wool and do everything in-house, some merchants from the cities came up with an idea. They turned it into the putting out system, where every single family would actually have a responsibility in the entire system, right? So basically, Mr. Terry shows up with the cotton or the wool or any kind of fabric material, and I would take it to the Leday and Lee family, who are the spinners, right? Or the carders, who separate it into long strands and then spin it into thread. I then pick it up from them, and then I take it to the Lee and the Wilson family house, where they actually weaved it and loomed it into cloth. I then picked up the finished cloth on the back end, and then I went to town and I sold it, right? Everybody in this system was making money. Now, the poorer people in the cottages, of course, are not making as much money as I would be making, but the biggest thing about it, though, in the long run is that's the putting out system, which is, of course, an element or the intrinsic, like mechanization, basically, of the cottage industry, right? And the thing about the rich, though, is they're going to start to realize this, right? They're going to realize that the merchants are going to these enclosure families and actually using the cottage system and the putting out system, and they're going to be like, wait a minute, if I had a bunch of cottages next to each other and they're all doing that, that's pretty much a factory, right? So you've got the growth of a proto-factory system. An early factory system and this stuff will then later on lead to the industrial revolution. So the agricultural revolution, the enclosure movement, the cottage industry, all that stuff is related to the industrial revolution because you're creating a surplus not only of goods, but also of labor, right? So going into it, though, also you have to understand, though, that some families could not stay in the rural areas, right? Because they had nowhere to go, right? The common lands got gobbled up by the enclosures. Some families were staying on the other enclosures, and they didn't have anywhere else to go. So you got families like the Marx family, or you got the, who else? We got the Barber family, and we got, like, the Hebler family. They had to move, right? And where's the only place you can go find work? You can go to a city, right? So they actually went to the cities, and this is a process known as urbanization. Now, I hate to break this to you girls, the ones that are now actually moving to these urbanized cities, you're going into some pretty gross cities, right? Like, so the cities are really disgusting at this point. You could find work, which was nice, right? You could easily find work, but the places where you typically lived were on the outskirts of the cities and things called tenement housing, and there was also no plumbing yet. Plumbing still did not exist, so human waste literally sat in the streets and stuff like that. It is really, really gross. So like now, but the thing about it, though, is we'll talk about that as well a little bit later on. Now, the agricultural revolution actually leads to the sanitation of cities later on because it gets so nasty that people start getting cholera and dying, right? So going into it, though, also you need to understand that women, though, are going to begin to lose their labor roles. Now, in the old common land system and in the old farming system, women had to work just as much as men to produce food. Now, as this system begins to grow and technology begins to replace a lot of the labor, a lot of the women are going to begin to lose their actual labor jobs that actually exist in those fields and on those farms. And so they're going to actually lose a lot of their labor roles and become more sedentary and actually begin to work mostly within the cottages and things like that. Now, last but not least, what about Eastern Europe, right? Well, Eastern Europe is going to see this happen to them too, but way later, right? Okay, like you have to understand something about European history. Everything moves in a big wave, right? The wave started this time in the Netherlands and in England, and it's going to wave out to the rest of Europe. But by the time it finally hits Eastern Europe, they're already starting the Industrial Revolution in Western Europe, okay? So you have to understand that feudalism and serfdom kind of kept holding on in Eastern Europe for quite some time, right? Now, the next major change that we have to talk about is the change on the family, right? Before 1750 and after 1750. So we're going to see completely different things about how these people operate, right? So before 1750, 1750, the average age of marriage was about 25 to 27, right? The only way to marry also was through an economic arrangement. You did not choose who you got married to. You actually basically had it chosen for you. Many marriages were arranged, and there was also a system called a bride price or a dowry, where a family would literally have to pay the husband's family to take the woman, right? Because the thing about it was they were seen basically as a burden, right? So when we're going, which is ridiculous and stupid. Well, so when we're going into this, though, the only way you could actually get married was basically to enter into an economic arrangement with another family. However, something that we need to understand about this is that during like the actual Middle Ages, you saw the adoption of this thing called the nuclear family. During the Middle Ages, you saw the nuclear family growing, and what that is mom, dad, and their kids. Not mom, dad, and the extended family, grandma, grandpa, and the kids. It was just mom, dad, and the kids, right? That started in the Middle Ages. Now, after 1750, the nuclear family is going to continue to grow, and you're going to see that become more and more widespread, especially in urban environments, right? And then also as well in rural environments too. You're going to see the growth of that nuclear family, and you're going to see the movement away from extended families living in the same homes in Western Europe, whereas in Eastern Europe, you could have multiple generations of families living in the same place because the feudal system is still really, really clung to things. Now, with more jobs, though, with urbanization, with people moving into other areas, you're going to see people getting married at a little bit of a younger age, right? Instead of 25 to 27, they're getting married more so on like 24 to 25. And also, marriage is not going to be based anymore on an economic relationship. It's going to be based on love, right? Like, so people are actually beginning to like choose each other and choose their partners based on attraction and also do they like them or not. Now, before 1750, though, with the bulk of people also living in villages, you had these really interesting things that popped up called community controls, right? So let's say hypothetically, for example, a woman got pregnant out of wedlock, right? So what would happen in a community, they were basically the rules of the village that actually guided the moral value of the entire group of people. Wow, that was one of the best examples, or actually best descriptions of anything I think I've ever given. But that literally is what it was. It literally was a group of rules that actually guided the moral value of the entire village. So let's say a woman got pregnant out of wedlock, that community would be like, all right, you're getting married to that guy, go for it. And you literally were pushed into marriage, right? Another famous one as well was this things called the chivalry rides, which basically if a man ever beat his wife, he was forced to ride on a horse backwards while holding up the tail while people pelted him with fruit and vegetables, right? So you were not even allowed to actually subjugate or hurt a family member of yours because the village would find out and the village would punish you. You see how that works? A community control, right? So now, however, though, if we've got young people moving from the rural areas into the cities where they don't have these community controls anymore, we're going to see a lot of stuff going down that they weren't supposed to be doing. And you're going to see this thing called the illegitimacy explosion happen right after 1750, where a massive number of illegitimate babies was being born throughout most of Europe, right? And so basically these are children that are coming out of marriage, right? To give you a good statistic as an example, 2% of births in German-speaking lands before 1750 were illegitimate births. And then after 1750, it's going to be 10%, which is a huge growth, which means 1 out of every 10 babies born was actually born to parents that were not actually married. But what we're going to do is we're going to pick up right there when we actually get back to class. We're going to talk about babies, and we're going to talk about how basically the Enlightenment is going to make people like babies a little bit more. But I'll talk to y'all soon. Y'all